What is up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and I hope that everybody had a fun holiday break. I know that I typically get about 2 weeks off, and so I got a couple of days left. I'm trying to soak in the last couple of days of vacation before I have to go back to work. So hopefully everybody enjoyed their holidays. If you're watching this the day that it comes out, hopefully you have some fun but safe New Year's Eve plans for tonight. My wife and I are a little old. We don't really partake in the typical New Year's Eve shenanigans. We've been ordering Chinese food for the last like 5-6 years. I don't know how that started, but it's become kind of our tradition. We'll order some Chinese food and then we'll watch a Harry Potter movie. Typically around Christmas, New Year's time, around that time period, we'll rewatch all the Harry Potter movies. I think we're on the Order of the Phoenix, which coincidentally is my least favorite Harry Potter movie. So if you're watching this literally as it drops, I'm probably, as we speak, eating Chinese food and watching Order of the Phoenix. However, obviously, that's not what this video is about. I want to talk about my top 5 favorite Harry Potter movies. No, of course not. I purposely had this release on New Year's Eve because I wanted it to be the last day of 2024. We're gonna kind of put a bow on 2024, and I want to talk about my top 5 favorite video games of the year before we kind of move on to 2025. So without further ado, let's rock. So I wanted to start off this video a little different this year. Of course, this video is all about talking about games that I loved playing. And so I don't want to be super negative in this video, but I did want to discuss at least one game that I didn't enjoy in case you guys were thinking about playing it. My least favorite game of 2024 by far was South Park Snow Day. And I'm going to show my age a little bit in this video, but I was in the 4th grade when South Park first aired. And so when I say I grew up on this show, I literally mean it. My buddies and I would make a point to go out and get food every Wednesday. Typically it was White Castle right before South Park was going to come on when we were in college, and we would hurry back home and eat our food while we watched the new episode of South Park. So I literally grew up on this show, and I absolutely loved The Stick of Truth and Fractured Butthole. It kind of felt like those games were playing in an extended episode of the series. And I don't know who made this decision or why they decided to take the sophisticated combat, and maybe sophisticated is the wrong word because you literally use your farts as a weapon in the first 2 games. Let's just say nuanced turn-based combat of the first games, and turned it into this like chaotic co-op brawler. But whoever made that decision really messed up. The animation style of the show has never really been that amazing, but at least the first games looked like the show. South Park Snow Day, even though I did appreciate that they based the game in a snow day because it felt like an episode of the show, at least in concept, Snow Day looked like an old 64 game. Yes, it would have been an impressive 64 game, but a Nintendo 64 game nonetheless. But the biggest sin of South Park Snow Day was built to be this co-op game, and the multiplayer, at least when I first played it, because I played it at launch, the multiplayer was essentially broken. I'm not sure if it's fixed by now because I have no desire to go back to play this game, but anytime I attempted to get a party together, it never worked. It either wouldn't connect with anybody, and then when it would rarely connect with somebody, it would immediately kick us out as soon as we started the game. So I was literally forced to play a game clearly designed to be a co-op game solo, and it was aggressively unfun to play. I even planned on releasing a full review video on this channel when it launched, but I didn't have the heart to finish it, so I just scrapped that entire video. All right, so I gotta wash the taste of South Park Snow Day out of my mouth. So we're gonna start this video with 2 honorable mentions. Both are on this list as honorable mentions and not part of the actual top 5 for very distinct reasons. The first honorable mention, Nine Souls, is only on this list simply because I started playing it about a week ago and haven't beaten it yet. I have been absolutely obsessed with this game, and I honestly am kind of embarrassed that I didn't start playing it earlier. It definitely would have made my official list. Nine Souls, if you're not aware, is this From Software inspired Metroidvania where you play as this kind of kung fu kitty cat in this Kill Bill-esque revenge story. And I'm a huge fan of the Ori and the Blind Forest games, and it feels very much like one of those games with the combat style of a Dark Souls or Sekiro. The art style, mixed with great music and sound design, makes Nine Souls one of the best games I've played in 2024. It is difficult, so you should know that going in. There's going to be a lot of trial and error, so progress has been pretty slow for me, which is the only reason why it's an honorable mention. So I do want you to keep that in mind as we go along in my actual top 5. If I had started this game earlier when it first came to Game Pass, because it is on Game Pass currently, I think it came in like late November, I certainly, assuming it stuck the landing, it would have made my official top 5. Speaking of games that should be in my top 5 that aren't because I'm a weirdo about my lists, Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC is the game between replaying the base game in anticipation of the DLC and then actually playing the DLC, is the game I played the most this year. It is literally the game that I put the most time into throughout 2024. I basically got re-obsessed with Elden Ring because of the DLC. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours playing Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree. I'm gonna literally talk about my gaming resolutions next week in that video, and I'm gonna eat a lot of shit about my last year's resolutions, and a lot of that has to do with I didn't get the stuff I wanted to get done this year in gaming because I spent so much time playing this game. But unlike the Game Awards, I don't want to put a DLC on my official list because the nature of DLCs are they're an extension of the original game. You can't just buy Shadow of the Erdtree and just start playing. A lot of people who actually played and beat Elden Ring couldn't even play the DLC when they first bought it because they hadn't actually beaten the optional Blood Omen boss yet. But as far as the DLC itself is concerned, what can I say that hasn't already been said? Elden Ring is officially one of my favorite games of all time. I've said this a million times, but I'm going to say it again in this video. Elden Ring is so good that I'm sure there's a generation of gamers that Elden Ring isn't just one of their favorite games of all time. It is literally their favorite game of all time. I think that Elden Ring is going to be talked about in the same vein as like a Skyrim or an Ocarina of Time. And Shadow of the Erdtree is a great 30 to maybe 50 hours extension of Elden Ring. I do remember when this DLC first launched, hearing some people complain about how the difficulty spiked up in the DLC. And maybe it was just because I had been playing Elden Ring for a few hundred hours leading up to the release of the DLC that I didn't notice the difficulty spike. However, I didn't think it was that bad. Also, From Software is infamous for not holding your hand, but kind of giving you in subtle ways the tools to beat their games. I think the best example of this is the beginning of Demon Souls. The very first boss that you have to fight in Demon Souls has a very particular vulnerability that you can exploit. And you know that vulnerability, not because the game explicitly tells you that, but because they kind of do by giving you weapons with that vulnerability in mind. So if you're paying attention, From Software games a lot of times will tell you without explicitly telling you how to play the game. So if you were complaining about how difficult Shadow of the Erdtree was, but yet you didn't use your fragments, then you weren't paying enough attention to what the game was actually telling you. Shadow of the Erdtree is easily the best game, and I use game in quotes, that I played all year, but since it's only a DLC, I didn't want to put it on my official list. But it is a fantastic DLC, and probably, off the top of my head, is probably the best DLC I've ever played in my life. All right, so on to my top 5. And I know right away some people might roll their eyes with my first selection, College Football 25. I know a lot of hardcore gamers look down on sports video games, but I've said this before on past videos, I'm a big sports fan, especially football. I grew up on football sim games like NFL Game Day, 2K5, and of course Madden. And even though I'm much more of a fan of the NFL than I am of college football, NCAA Football 14 is arguably one of the best, if not best, football sim games ever made. There is a whole community of modders that has been keeping that game alive by updating the rosters every year. Well, that's no longer necessary, because that was the last college football game we had gotten until College Football 25. And while College Football 25 is far from a perfect game, I had a few nitpicks that I discussed in my Road to Glory review when that game first launched. It's still a great football sim game. I loved the on the field stuff, especially the updated pass protection stuff that made this game feel fresh. They also included it later in the year in Madden 25, which of course that game will not be making this list. And even though both college football and Madden are made by EA, I was excited to see if they would push each other. Not that EA is allergic to putting out embarrassing games, it's actually quite the opposite. They do it so often, it feels like it's almost like their kink to put out embarrassing games. It would be extremely embarrassing if there was a cool feature in college football that wasn't in Madden or vice versa. So I was definitely excited to see if College Football 25 was good and they put some interesting features in that game, would those features then make Madden better and vice versa? And so far, so good. I'm really glad that we have a college football game again. I'm assuming, unless they do something crazy with College Football 26, I will not be adding it to my list every year. I just wanted to point it out because it's the first college football game that we've had in a long time, and it was very, very good. So back to the games that you would actually expect from a list like this. Number 4 is Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga. And I'm sure I wasn't the only kid gamer who dreamed about games actually looking like their trailers. I'm sure every gamer has had that thought from time to time. Well, it only took about 30-ish years, but the dream finally came true with Senua's Saga. I remember a few years ago when they showed this game off as kind of the poster child for the capabilities of the new Xbox. I even thought to myself when I saw that initial trailer that there's no way the game looks that good when it releases in a few years. And I don't like to be wrong, but in this rare case, I am happy to report that I was wrong. This is easily the best looking game I've ever played in my entire life. And that fidelity really helped bring out Melina Juergens's excellent performance, a performance that earned her another game award this year. And this game definitely leaned heavy into the great cinematics. The combat of the first game was more of this kind of simple Soulsborne type of combat, but in the sequel, it was more of an interactive movie. I hate to compare it to the combat of a game like Callisto Protocol because that game's combat really rubbed me the wrong way. But Senua's Saga's combat had a similar quality to it, where once you got the hang of it, it kind of felt like a dance that flowed in and out of this awesome cinematics. There's a battle towards the end of the game where I literally had a hard time telling the difference between the actual combat and the cutscene. That's how well this game kind of flows in and out of the combat and the cinematics. The only major issue I had with this otherwise awesome game is the story just didn't quite live up to the original story. It didn't have that same punch as Senua's Sacrifice. It's not a bad story by any means. It just felt like they knew exactly the type of story that they wanted to tell with the first game. And then the first game was a success, so they had to write this follow-up story, and they just didn't have that same passion behind it. Fortunately, the writing was not the issue for my number 3 favorite game of the year, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. The story was absolutely fantastic, so much so that I had a hard time telling between the main story and the side quests. Everything felt so important. There was such great character development in the side missions, especially between Indy and his love interest Gina, because of course it's an Indiana Jones story. There has to be a woman. That side stuff was so well written that I would suggest that if you play this game, which of course it's on my top 5 favorite games of the year, so I would suggest you play it. It is day one on Game Pass, so if you have that service, you could play it right now. That you do as much side stuff as you can if you do play this game. There's a big character reveal with Gina that won't hit as hard if you don't spend a little time with her while you're in Egypt. But at its core, The Great Circle is an Indiana Jones story. And as a longtime fan of the original trilogy, I've been watching those movies even longer than I've been watching South Park. I was definitely happy they set The Great Circle during the original trilogy. Even though the Dial of Destiny was far better than the absolute shit show that was the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I still couldn't handle another old Indiana Jones story. And one thing about the character of Indiana Jones that I have always loved that I think kind of gets lost in the action adventure aspect of the movies is that he kind of has that Batman quality to him. Batman is always described as the world's greatest detective. Well, if that's true, Indiana Jones may be the second best. Yes, he's this great brawler. He's good at hand-to-hand combat, and there's a lot of fist fighting in this game that we'll get to here in a second. He's also this world famous archaeologist who speaks different languages. And I think that kind of gets lost in the shuffle of the original films. But The Great Circle nailed that aspect of his character. They also managed to write a villain in Voss that was equally as intelligent as Indy, and he was also just really, really interesting. He kind of felt like the evil Indiana Jones. It's almost like they flipped a coin. Indy got to be the good version of the character, and Voss got to be the bad version of the character. And it certainly didn't hurt that Troy Baker absolutely killed his performance as Indiana Jones. I knew going into this game that Harrison Ford didn't voice Indiana Jones. But once I started playing The Great Circle, I still had to look it up because Troy Baker sounded so much like a young Indiana Jones that I thought I was wrong and that maybe they did get Harrison Ford. Marios Gavrilis, which I doubt I pronounced his first and last name right, and I apologize if I didn't, did an equally great job as Voss as well. Tony Todd, Candyman himself, was also great in this game. Unfortunately, he passed away shortly before this game was released, but he was also fantastic. All the performances were really good, which added to this game. And I mentioned the hand-to-hand combat earlier, and a lot of that was fun. There was even these underground boxing fight clubs that you could get into once you had a certain disguise, and they were a ton of fun. Like I said earlier, if you're only going to do some of the side stuff, I would suggest at least doing the Gina Egypt stuff so that character reveal hits hard towards the end of the game. And then, of course, do these underground fighting clubs. They are so much fun. All that being said, the gun combat felt like an afterthought, which was surprising because The Great Circle was developed by Machine Games, who have made the most recent Wolfenstein games, which is really weird that they just so happened to make another Nazi game. So that's kind of a weird coincidence. But at its core, Indiana Jones and The Great Circle definitely leans into the stealth melee combat. Literally, when you first start this game, the first area that you get to, there are melee weapons everywhere. This game definitely wants you to sneak up on people and knock them out. And if you do get discovered, which you will, because unfortunately the enemy AI was dumb as a box of rocks, which definitely put a damper on my enjoyment of this game. When you do get caught, the game definitely wants you to kind of just fight them hand to hand and brawl with them. So the gun combat it definitely left much to be desired, to say the least. But outside of that, it was a really, really fun experience for a fan of the original trilogy. All right, so I know I went a little long on my number 3, only because, spoiler alert, it's the only game on my top 5 that I didn't release some sort of a review video on this channel. I did plan on, and I did record, I would say probably 75% of a Indiana Jones and the Great Circle review, but I had some microphone issues that I'm hoping is finally fixed in this video. If you're listening to this, it's either fixed or it's good enough that I felt like I could release this video, but I digress. I will be quicker with my top 2, the first being Black Myth Wukong. Video games have a long history of announcing games out of nowhere, and people get excited to only have the game either never release or release to disappointment because it's not the game we thought it was going to be. And I made several videos about the dumpster fire that was the day before, which is kind of the perfect example from earlier this year of this exact thing happening. So yes, I, like many other gamers, were excited when we first saw footage of Black Myth Wukong several years ago, but I assumed we would never actually get to play the game, or if we did, it would not live up to the hype. Again, as I was talking about earlier, I hate to be wrong, but in this case, I'm happy I misjudged this game. The unknown studio, Game Science, knocked it out of the park with their first major release. They had a very distinct vision for what they wanted Black Myth Wukong to be, and they really hammered it home. They were able to blend the From Software intense boss battle style of combat with the old Chinese novel Journey to the West. And while it's clearly inspired by the Soulsborne games that have come before it, Black Myth is far from just a clone of those games. The boss battles, while difficult, were satisfying in that trial and error type of way. When you finally beat the boss that you've been struggling with for an hour or so, I don't think that there's a better feeling in all of gaming. And there are hundreds of great boss battles. Like I said, this game is a lot different than those Soulsborne games that have come before it. In those games, at least the games that I've played, you kind of have to make your way through a dungeon to get to a boss, and sometimes you'd come across like these mini bosses along the way. But in Black Myth Wukong, especially early on in the game, there are so many great boss battles that sometimes it felt like you would walk 20 steps in the early game and you would come across another boss battle. And honestly, for a couple of months, I assumed this was going to be my game of the year because I enjoyed it so much. That was until my favorite game of the year was released, and that is Silent Hill 2 Remake. And I talked about this in my review. I never played the original game. I rented the first Resident Evil game when I was a kid, and as a young kid, I really couldn't get over the tank controls. And after several hours, I just had to put down that first game, and I didn't circle back to the original franchise for decades. And when the Silent Hill games were getting released, I kind of chalked them up as Resident Evil clones. And I didn't like those games, so why would I like the Silent Hill games? And I was definitely a dumb boy, because the Resident Evil games, now that I've circled back to them, are some of my favorite games of all time. Resident Evil Village is literally one of my favorite games of all time. And Silent Hill 2 Remake is my favorite game of 2024. It is very rare for a game that I've heard has one of the best video game stories of all time to actually exceed my expectations. But that's exactly what this remake did. I expected the story to be good, and I was still knocked on my ass with the big reveal. I'm a huge fan of survival horror, and this game, between the use of the fog in the town sections, to the darkness in the prison section, to the time in the other world, this game freaked me the hell out. The environment, the sound design, all of it was pitch perfect. I will say the monsters you fight along the way do get a bit predictable, especially once you figure out their moveset, but the game does a great job with adding new monsters and adding new abilities to old monsters to kind of keep you on your toes. The prison section that I mentioned earlier also introduced a new monster that could crawl on the ceiling, so you would always hear them kind of click-clacking around in the dark, and that would freak me the hell out. I was also pleasantly surprised at how much exploration there was in the Silent Hill 2 remake. I expected it to be a very linear story, which I've actually heard the original game was, and they've just added a lot of exploration in the remake, which I appreciate. Even though I didn't play the original game, I still had my expectations going in, and they exceeded that, and not just the story, but also the exploration. It's certainly not an open world game by any means. It felt very similar to like a game like The Last of Us Part 2, where you can kind of explore certain buildings and parts of Seattle, but obviously you can't explore everything. Silent Hill 2 definitely felt like that, where you could go into certain buildings, but not everything. So it definitely felt like it was way more open world than the linear game I expected it to be. And all in all, I loved my time with the Silent Hill 2 remake, and it's just another thing that you can add to the long list of things Baby Patty was wrong about. But as always, those are just my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below, especially if there was a game that you really think that I missed. Let me know in the comments below. One thing that I love, absolutely love about video games is, even though I try to play everything, like everything I can physically play in a year, I have a full-time job, I have a family, all that good stuff, and so I can't play everything. Video games takes up a lot of my time, so I can't play everything. So there are going to be different genres and subgenres that I'm just not going to be that interested in, because it's not games that I play. So let me know in the comments below if I missed a game. Of course, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, as the kids say. It's just a free and easy way to tell YouTube that you enjoyed this video, and they should push it to other people that might enjoy it as well. Of course, if you did enjoy this video, which I assume that you did because you've made it this far in the video, definitely consider subscribing. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. That way you get notified every time I post another video. I try to post weekly gaming related content, so if you're into that, definitely consider subscribing and dinging that bell. But until next week, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy, and we were just talking, and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?